Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Fornash, and I am from McGuireWoods Consulting. I co-lead the education team with my partner, Scott Freen, who is also here with us today. And we are delighted that you've joined us for this overview of the federal response to COVID-19 for states and institutions of higher education. We are particularly thrilled that we have Dr. Tom Harnisch with us. Dr. Harnisch is from SHEHO, which many of you may recognize as the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, and he actually came to the SHEHO in January just in time to start this journey with the federal government and the response that's needed due to COVID-19 for our higher education institutions. And we're very fortunate to have him, as he really is on the front lines fighting for the CARES Act and the dollars that are needed to help our higher education institutions during this particularly challenging time. Prior to joining SHEHO, Dr. Harnisch was at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. Many of you may have met him there, where he was the Director of State Relations and Policy Analysis, and he also coordinated their annual Government Relations Conference. I know many of you that are participating today have attended that conference. He's a frequent author. He's been quoted in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, Inside Higher Ed, and the Chronicle. And he's also an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University and the George Washington University. So we're just thrilled that he's with us today to share his insights. He's got about 20 slides that he will go through. We will make these slides available later today, as well as this recorded session, so that you can view it or share it with others who may be of interest. And we are going to have an opportunity at the end of the slides for a Q&A period. And so you should see a window on your screen that will allow you to type in a question. And so we'll facilitate the Q&A after the presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Harnisch.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank you to the McGuireWoods Consulting team for having me today. As Laura said, I'm Tom Harnisch. I'm the Vice President for Government Relations at the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association. And also, as Laura said, I did get a baptism by fire into this job. I just joined them in late January, and they put me to work right away with this situation that we're currently in. So I would like to first talk a little bit about SHEHO and the work that we do. SHEHO is a national higher education association. It's based in Boulder, Colorado, but we just started our DC office earlier this year, and our membership is the chief executives of statewide governing, policy, and coordinating boards of post-secondary education and their staffs. So we represent in Virginia, for example, our member is Peter Blake, and the Chev team in the Commonwealth. We've been in higher education for 66 years. Many of you know us for our CHEF report, that's the State Higher Education Finance Report, that will be coming out soon. But we also we're expanding our government relations as well as policy research capacity. And we have a number of projects that we're working on right now with respect to state higher education policy, state authorization, the response to COVID-19. So really a very active participant in the higher education community. We do remain committed to the equitable education of all Americans. This is our mission, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or socioeconomic factors. So we are constantly pushing for broadening access to high quality, affordable post-secondary education opportunities. So just to get right into this current crisis, this has had a numerous effect, as many of you know, numerous challenges it's presented to colleges and universities, public, private, for-profit, throughout the country. The first is certainly the loss in campus auxiliary revenue, so housing. When we talk auxiliary revenue, we're talking about housing refunds. We're talking about the dining plan refunds, lost parking revenue, canceled events, fundraising opportunities that are no longer available. increased costs. So not only are we losing money from these campus auxiliary revenues, but we're also increased costs due to the transition to online education. So moving employees to remote access, consultants, laptops. As Laura pointed out, I am a faculty member in addition to my work at SHIO, and I've transitioned to and had to go to Zoom sessions with my students. So faculty members across the country and students are making the transition to online education. Drops in research revenue, cleaning and sanitation costs, and certainly other costs such as repatriating students from abroad. So a variety of costs and lost revenues for institutions. I know I asked some of you on the phone here to provide examples of the cost increases and losses in revenue that we presented to Hill staff. So thank you. And certainly we at SHIO and those of you who are at SHIO member agencies, the more information that you can provide to us, the better, as we make our case to Congress for increased investments in higher education in the next stimulus package. So the third stimulus proposal, so we had two more modest stimulus packages, and then we had the third package, which you all are familiar with, that ended up being the CARES Act. SHIO was part of a coalition of higher education associations, both public and private. This was led by the American Council on Education, but it included the presidential associations representing public and private colleges throughout the country, as well as an array of other higher education associations, got behind a unified plan for investments in higher education and to help them during this crisis situation. That plan that we all presented to Congress was based on 4 pillars: emergency aid to students and institutions, access to low-cost capital, a technology implementation fund, and temporary regulatory flexibility. So those are the 4 things that we really asked for to help us navigate this crisis. So what did we get out of it? We did get emergency aid to students and institutions, which I'll talk about here in a bit. Did we get access to low-cost capital? Not really. They wanted certainly access to low-cost capital because institutions are in a cash crunch, as I talked about the lost revenue and the increased cost. Certainly the enrollment decline in the summer term, as well as prospects of sharp declines in enrollment in the fall term. There can be real cash flow issues for institutions, public and private. So did we get that? Well, we got institutions with below 500 employees will have access to the Small Business Administration loans, but that will include, as employees, student employees. So we're talking then, when you factor in all the student employees, we're talking about pretty small institutions of higher education. We did not get money for a technology implementation fund, so this would be funds for laptops and webcams and other technology to help with the transition online. There is no technology implementation fund in the CARES Act. And then finally, temporary regulatory flexibility. Yes, we did receive that from the federal government. The Department of Education has provided significant regulatory flexibility using their power, but certainly some things are in federal law. And so Congress has been helpful in issues with deadlines and compliance orders and the like in the CARES Act. So we did score some victories there. So I'd like to talk about the money situation from Congress. So the CARES Act was signed into law by President Trump on March 27th. That included $30.75 billion in a state stabilization package. 3.8% of the money will go to governors. 43.9% to K-12, and 46.3% to higher education. So that is how it is distributed. Now, let's turn first to that 46.3% for higher education. 90% of that aid will be based on a formula. This is money that will go directly to institutions of higher education. It will bypass state governments. So the state has no bearing on this money. 90% of it will go to a formula, and that formula is 75% based on relative share of Pell FTE students. So Pell full-time equivalent students. So there was a article the other day in Inside Higher Ed, and other people have been talking about this does, advantage institutions that serve full-time students. A lot of community colleges, for example, serve large shares of part-time students, but this is full-time equivalent students. So that is the formula is weighted heavily toward the number of full-time equivalent low-income students that you have, and then 25% to non-Pell FTE shares. So that is the formula breakdown. And then that aid that goes to these institutions, at least 50% must be spent on students. And then the remaining 10% will go to institutions of higher education under Title III, Title V, and Title VII of the Higher Education Act. And these are chiefly minority-serving institutions in Title III and Title V. So Title V especially is Hispanic-serving institutions, and Title III is HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions. Title VII is the FIPSE program, and that the Secretary has discretion over how she will distribute funds under Title VII. Now, for those in state government, this is a key issue, the magnets of effort required. So the magnets of effort requirements, as some of you may remember from the Recovery Act over a decade ago, magnets of effort requirements are provisions in federal law that require states to maintain funding at a certain level. So it could be you maintain your funding at fiscal year 2015 or the average of the last few years. This one included a magnets of effort provision that states must maintain their funding for K-12 and higher education at the average of the last 3 years. And that magnets of effort requirement applies to the 9.8% in the governor's fund and the 43.9% in the K-12 fund. It does not apply to the money in the higher education fund because, as I said earlier, that money will go directly to institutions and bypass states. Now, you may think to yourself, well, this is a pretty high bar. If states are going to be losing significant amounts of money and their revenues are going to have a precipitous decline, how are they going to maintain funding at the average of the last 3 years? Well, this magnets of effort provision is sort of watered down in the sense that it includes a waiver. So you can make your case to the Secretary of Education that your state has had a precipitous decline in revenue, and she will have the power to waive that provision in the law. So it does include a magnets of effort provision for FY20 and FY21, but it does not. It is weakened significantly by the existence of that waiver provision. So in this next slide, I go down, and this is just the estimated breakdown. You can go on the department's website; they have the final numbers, but this was just the estimations that I did for the money that will go to institutions of higher education and K-12 and the Governor's Education Emergency Fund. So about $14 billion will go to higher education institutions directly, a little over $13 billion to K-12, and then about $3 billion to the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. And remember, with that money to higher education, about 50% of that formula fund has to go to, at least 50% has to go to students. Other provisions in the CARES Act, and I'll circle back to the requirements and parameters on the funding, but there was no tax relief for public universities for paid sick and family leave. So one of the previous stimulus packages required employers to extend paid sick and family leave associated with those who have coronavirus. And it provided a tax credit for them. It explicitly excluded, however, public entities, and that includes public universities. So there was no tax relief in there for them. This is something that they lobbied hard for, but it is something that they did not get. And as we talked about the potential next stimulus package, this is something that higher education is going to continue to fight for. Student loans. So this is a real flashpoint in Congress. It was a real flashpoint during the CARES Act. There was certainly calls to suspend student loans, so basically putting a pause on student loan payments, and that was approved and that will be in effect until 9/30 of 2020. So the end of September, students do not have to pay their student loans. They will not face any penalties. They will not face any interest accumulation. They will not face garnishment of their wages. So student loans are on pause until September 30th. Now, the Democrats pushed for some student loan relief, such as up to $10,000 in student loan relief. That was not included in the final compromise bill. Certainly, as this situation evolves and future stimulus bills play out, there will be continued calls, particularly in the Democratic caucus, for not just student loan suspension, but also student loan relief. As I talked about earlier, a variety of flexibilities on Title IV financial aid. Employers, including universities, can delay their FICA payments until January 1, 2021. The Small Business Administration loans, so that is something we're tracking, as the disbursement of those loans. And then new opportunities for charitable deduction. So certainly there was concern from the 2017 tax bill about charitable deductions and the increase in the standard deduction and how that would affect charitable gifts. This legislation includes new opportunities for tax-advantaged charitable deductions. So now let's go back and talk about the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund. So this was part of the CARES Act that I talked about. This is the 9.8%, or around $3 billion. So nearly $3 billion will be distributed electively to governors. So they're going to have around $3 billion, and they're going to have a formula, and the money is going to be distributed to states based on their formula. That formula and the allocation amounts are available on the web at ed.gov. So you can see how much states will be getting in this Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. This money can be used for K-12. It can be used for higher education, or it can be used as a blend of both. Governors have broad latitude in their use of these funds. This fund is subject to the magnets of effort requirement, or if you do not meet the magnets of effort requirement, you do have to seek a waiver from the Department of Education. And governors have 1 year to use the funds. Now, we have been talking, I was in a Zoom session this morning. Some states are coordinating between K-12 and higher education of how they want to go about presenting a plan to their governor for the disbursement of those funds. I'm sure other states will not have such collaboration between the K-12 and higher education communities. But that money, if you're going to be advocating for your institution, your state system of higher education, now is the time to do it, because governors will be receiving that money soon if they haven't already. So if you're going to make the case for higher education to receive money, this $3 billion pot of funds, that needs to happen soon. So we'll now go from the Governor's Education Relief Fund to, and just as part of that, SHEO, as part of its research effort, as part of its continued effort to share information and best practices, we are requesting information from states. For you, those of you on the phone from SHEO agencies, we're requesting information on how states plan to use and distribute these funds. So please share that with our David Tanberg. He's our Vice President for Policy Research and Strategic Initiatives. So we can bring all that information together and track how this money is being used in the states. So now we'll transition to the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. So $14 billion to institutions. This goes directly to institutions, so it's not subject to the magnitude of effort requirement. It is distributed based on that formula that I talked about, and then 10% will be distributed directly by the Secretary to the minority-serving institutions. And again, at least 50% must be spent through emergency grants. So let's break that down. So the Student Emergency Grant Aid, so $6.828 billion to public, private, and for-profit institutions. So this is the 50% that needs to go to students. This grant aid to students must be distributed through checks, debit cards, or electronic funds transfer. It cannot be posted to student accounts. It cannot be used to pay off a student's balance with the university. So it has to be kept separate from those accounts. This money cannot be used by institutions to reimburse themselves for refunds for housing and meal plans. So institutions throughout the country have, many of them have prorated plans to refund housing costs, refund dining plans. Institutions cannot use this money to reimburse themselves. The only way they can reimburse themselves is if after March 27th, which was when President Trump signed the bill into law, they provided emergency aid to students. That is the only way that institutions can reimburse themselves under this part of the CARES Act. Students must be Title IV participants or eligible to receive aid under Title IV of the Higher Education Act. Therefore, undocumented students, DACA students, and international students are ineligible for aid under this program. And I know there's certainly been some letters that have gone up to the Hill and to the department advocating against this particular policy, but this is the way the administration chose to interpret this law. So undocumented DACA international students will not be eligible for emergency grant aid under this law. Those students who already are in the system through the filling out their FAFSA forms and receiving Title IV financial aid, those students will have an advantage in receiving this funds just because they have already demonstrated that they are eligible for Title IV financial aid. So those institutions or those students who are not in the system, who have not filled out FAFSA forms, they'll be at a disadvantage, and they need to fill out that FAFSA information and get that to institutions so they can demonstrate their eligibility for Title IV financial aid. So we'll transition now. We have the 50% to students, and now the other half to institutions. So $6.28 billion to public, private, for-profit institutions. This, again, the disbursement numbers for both the student part and the institution parts are available online at ed.gov. Secretary, this money should be used for institutions, and this says so in the law. They should be used to cover these funds to cover any costs associated with significant changes to delivery of instruction due to coronavirus. So the Secretary has urged institutions to use the funds to expand remote learning, strengthen IT, and train faculty and staff for remote learning. This money can also be used for emergency grant aid. So this money is going out to institutions already. Some have already applied for the funds. Some have already received the funds. Certainly we did have a dust-up yesterday. This money will go to all Title IV colleges and universities. This includes some of our wealthiest institutions, so Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and the like. And so there has been some pushback on that, and some of those institutions have said that they will not receive the funds. Instead, use those funds for less endowed institutions. So that is the institutional emergency grant aid. So stimulus 4. This is a discussion that's ongoing. We should be passing, if we haven't already, the stimulus package, sort of a stimulus package 3.5. So if CARES Act was 3.0, this would be 3.5. This is a smaller package aimed at small businesses, and this should be passed and signed into law too soon. The Congress is expected to take up another stimulus package in May. There has been a strong push for another stimulus package in May. As part of this, governors have been pushing for $500 billion to states as a rescue package. And that $500 billion is not subdivided into higher ed, K-12. It would be just $500 billion. That approach has received bipartisan support on the Hill from Republican Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, Democratic Senator Menendez of New Jersey. But just yesterday, Mitch McConnell said that it would be okay if states went bankrupt. I just saw on the news that Governor Cuomo of New York has fired back about that. But we'll see. There's something certainly that the higher education community, the higher education, I would say SHIO, has been pushing for is money and aid to the states. We have requested $31.2 billion in economic assistance to states for higher education. How did we come to that number? We came to that number by saying a 10% mid-year cut this year, 20% cuts, the prospect of 20% cuts next year, as well as cuts to financial aid and increases in demand for financial aid. This is a conservative estimate. This does not include funding for institutions based on increased cost and lost revenue from coronavirus. This is just, our calculus was just based on projections of state budget deficits. So, and then certainly other associations are pushing for other approaches. Certainly our colleagues at the private colleges will continue to push for direct aid to institutions. And a coalition has developed around continuing what happened in the CARES Act, which was that direct aid to institutions. And certainly that's an easier approach because that bill has been passed and that framework is recognizable by lawmakers. We are also urging the Federal Reserve, because of the cash crunch, that we are asking the Federal Reserve to extend the Main Street lending program. So they talk about aid to businesses in the Main Street lending program, but it's unclear whether nonprofits and public institutions can participate in that lending program. So there's been a coalition letter to the Federal Reserve urging them to extend this lending program to publics and nonprofit institutions. We've certainly endorsed the extended tax credits to public entities for extension of employee benefits, and we've also recently endorsed aid for broadband extension. Other issues just to highlight that are related. The Higher Education Act they were deep into discussions before this crisis hit. Some say that the Senate was pretty close to finding a bipartisan bill. That is on pause right now. visas. So visas for international students have been suspended as of March 20th. We have not heard any news from the agencies when they were going to restart that. But that information is available through State Department as well as Department of Homeland Security. And then new Title IX rules. Again, the higher education associations have urged the Department of Education not to publish these rules until we've gotten a better hold on this crisis. But those rules have passed OMB, and so they are at the Department of Education, and they theoretically could be dropped at any day. Just to, if you're interested in certainly getting the blow-by-blow of what's going on in higher education policy, we do put out a daily email that's available to everyone. It's the latest news, government reports, documents, all of that, state and federal, and that's available on our website at SHIO.gov or at SHIO.org. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Tom, thank you so much for that extremely comprehensive overview. We really appreciate the level of detail that you went into such a complicated series of acts that Congress has been passing. So thank you for that information and for these resources. The questions have started to come in, and so I'd like to turn to the Q&A now. And the first question is dealing with the maintenance of effort provision. The question says, to be clear, the maintenance of effort provision uses higher education funding to determine whether states are meeting the requirement, but higher education funding won't be affected even if the states do not meet the requirement. In other words, higher ed money is used to set the standard but not included in the penalty. Is that correct, Tom?
Yes, that is correct. That is correct. The only way higher education funding could be affected is through that governor's fund. So if they don't meet the maintenance of effort requirement and the states don't get the money to the governor's fund, and higher education institutions are eligible for money under the governor's fund, that's the only way that the institutions of higher education could be affected by the maintenance of effort provision. But again, the funding that goes directly to institutions is going from the Department of Education to institutions. It is bypassing states, so the maintenance of effort provision does not apply there. But yes, it is included in the calculation for the governor's fund as well as the K-12 education fund.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. Next question. While there is no relief for public institutions under the paid leave provisions of FFCRA, with the exception of the employer portion of OASDI on emergency paid sick leave and emergency FMLA paid leave, can the OASDI adjustments be done in arrears and adjusted on the next month FICA submission? This is a very technical question. For example, FFCRA leave benefits for April will not be reported to our institutions until April concludes and likely after we make our deposit for April FICA. Can we make the adjustment for April FICA to the May FICA deposit?
Right. Well, thanks, Brian, for the question. That's a great question. I would have to take that question and share it with my colleagues, likely at NACUBO or Coupa HR. I'm not sure exactly. I would have to get back to you on that one and find people with technical expertise on that. But that's a great question, and I know like there's been a lot of concerns about FICA submissions and so I will take that question and I will circle back to you.
Okay. The next question comes from James at the Hunt Institute. Do we know what happens to the higher education allocations for the wealthy schools who have said that they would not seek these funds? Is there a mechanism for redistributing these allocations to the other higher education institutions?
Right. So I got this question this morning because one of my colleagues in the States was wondering, hey, if I have a wealthy institution in my state that's turning down funds, will that money go to the state? would we be able to get a slice of that funding? My answer to that was very, very likely no. It won't go to the state. It will likely go back to the Department of Education because I didn't anticipate that institutions would give back the money. I'm going to have to check with the department and see how they are going to distribute it, and perhaps they could just have another round of money that they give out for institutions that decide to give money back to the department and just put it back into the formula again and give people, small checks based on that. I don't know, but I will follow up with some of my colleagues at the department, as I think, other people have asked this question as well.
Thank you, Tom. The next question was asking if we could go back to slide 12. So I've put that slide
Sure.
back up. We don't have a specific question relative to that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to share these slides out with everybody who's participated today. So hopefully you don't have to take too many notes. But if there are additional questions, please let me know. I do want to thank Tom again and really wish you, good luck as we're all advocating for this additional package and the flexibility that's needed. We know you're working for higher education every day on the front lines, in addition to many of those on the call today, and just can't say thank you enough for all the efforts that everybody has come together to really help in this very unusual time. I see I've got another question that's popped up into my queue here, so let me pull that up. Can institution use the CARES Act funds, not the direct aid to students, to reimburse themselves for the refunds already paid to students? Are there any restrictions on the use of these funds?
Right. Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, they can be used for that. There are restrictions on the use of that funds, and there is, and I want to make sure that I get the language correct on here, but there is, just double check here. The department did put out, if you go to ed.gov, they did put out an FAQ on this. So in the FAQ they asked, may institutions that have provided refunds to students for room and board, tuition, and other fees reimburse themselves from the funds from the recipient's institutional costs made through this? And the answer to that is yes. Institutions may use the funds to provide refunds to students for room and board, tuition, and other fees as a result of significant changes to delivery of instruction due to coronavirus. Institutions may reimburse themselves for refunds previously made to students on or after March 13, 2020, the date of the President's proclamation. So that is from the U.S. Department of Education. That's available on ed.gov.
Great, thank you. I also want to mention, while we've got everybody still on the line, that the McGuireWoods Consulting website also has a great resource for kind of all things CARE Act and coronavirus related, and that's from our website, which is mwcllc.com, and we'll be sure to include that information when we send out these slides later today. Well, Tom, those are all the questions that we have for today. I really can't say thank you enough for your time and all that you're doing for higher education, and thank you to all of those that are on the line today. We had over 200 people sign up for this call, and I think that says again how important this is and how many folks are working around the clock to ensure that our institutions and that our students are able to be successful during this time. So, Tom, any closing remarks?
Well, no, I just wanted to first thank everyone for tuning in, and thank you for all of the great questions, and look forward to circling back and trying to get answers to these questions, because I know other people likely have these questions as well. But I also wanted to thank you, Laura, and the McGuireWoods Consulting team for inviting me here today, and look forward to staying connected in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks again, Tom. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Take good care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.